Great. Well, thanks, Rebecca, and welcome to our event. I recognize actually some of the faces and I recognize some of the names. And I certainly want to say welcome to Joan. It's a great accomplishment. I want to congratulate on it. The jury consists not only of historians like myself, but of people coming from journalism, from different fields, and that means that the highly professional book is really the book that appeals to a broader audience, to different kind of peoples. And I know that you worked on it for quite a time. I remember our discussions a few years ago. So I know how much thought, how much time, how much effort, how much love went into that. So congratulations once again.
Thank you.
The book is about a film, right? So normally we deal with a situation where there is a book and then there is a film after that. But here we got the film first. And what a film. There are three parts, and one of them would be praised and would get Stalin's prize, and another would be showed only 10 years later. So that's probably where I would like to start our discussion and ask you, first of all, what the book is about and how you got interested in that subject.
Well, as you said, the book is about Eisenstein's film, Ivan the Terrible. It was a film that itself took a long time to make. It was commissioned by Stalin in January 1941. And then the war and evacuation and postponements and funding and the end of the war all slowed down production, which gave Eisenstein a lot of time to think about what it would be about and how he wanted to make it. And it gave him a lot of time to do an enormous amount of reading and thinking. So it turned out to be an incredibly complex film. And it took him a while also to decide just how complex he wanted to make the film. He could have made a propaganda film, as he says early in the process, a sort of simple, everyone would get the message, but he didn't think he could live with himself if he did that, if he didn't stretch his neck out, as he said. Mm-hmm. So the film is about Ivan the Terrible, the medieval czar, 16th century czar. Everyone expected it also to be about Stalin. Stalin expected it to be about Stalin. And it includes a very, I think, profound critique of Stalin and Stalinism. At the same time, he does a lot more than that in the film. He was really interested in how individuals become bloody dictators, what role childhood trauma plays in the things that happen in people's lives. And he explores the nature of power and violence themselves in history beyond Russia and the Soviet Union. So he's really sort of looking at these as historical events, historical phenomenon. And he does all that at the same time trying to put into practice many of the ideas that he's had over the past 10 or 15 years that he hasn't been able to put into practice because his films have been banned or stopped or never got off the ground in the first place. So it's also an incredibly innovative and experimental aesthetic work of art as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we often are asked about the title, right? There is a lot of thought goes into the title. The title is something that we have very little control over. There are certainly also editors and there are publishers. So your title is The Thin of Darkness. And you write in your book that at some point you got tired of studying all the terrible things that people did. And you wanted to study something positive, but you ended up writing book the Thin of Darkness, and you certainly there is Shakespeare, there is Brecht, whom you quote. It's about they will be sinning, it seems to me, but they will be sinning about dark times. And certainly when you look at the 16th century, at Ivan the Terrible, if you look at the late 1930s, these are very dark times in the Russian history. So how at the end you dealt with that issue? Again, you were looking for something positive, you were looking for light, and there was a lot of darkness around. How did you manage it?
Well, everything in Eisenstein is a contradiction, so that's where we start. The subject matter of the film, the world that Eisenstein was living in, the world that he was studying and making this film about, were violent and very difficult times. But the story I tell is really kind of I think a hopeful one, in the sense that this great artist not only conceived of a complex film that takes on all aspects of the world around him and really tries to explore how this world came to be. He not only thought about that, but he actually managed to make this incredible work of art about it. So, so in that sense, I think my book is about, the film is about a very dark time, but the book is about a kind of heroic effort to make a work of art against all sorts of obstacles.
Well, yes, indeed, and it reads that time that way. It's not a depressing book. It is the book that gives a lot of hope. And you quote Eisenstein at some point. He's talking after the success of his first part, talking to one of his acquaintances, and the acquaintance congratulates him and says that, well, наше дело правое, something like that, that our cause was right. And Eisenstein says, well, our cause was left, but it turned out to be right for a moment. And he was really very right in that sense, that again, he continued with the second part, and it was received very differently by the authorities. And I wonder whether you could talk about that relationship, how he happened to be right in 44 and then so wrong in 1946.
Well, that's a complex story, and also one that I think historians have generally gotten wrong. So part of the purpose of my book was really to show that Eisenstein conceived of the film as one whole, part 1, 2, and the unfinished part 3. But actually, you're kind of asking me two different questions. So the first question is, you know, who was the person making this film, and who was the person quoting, you know, talking to that was the actor who played Fyodor Basmanov. Eisenstein was someone who I think he's famous as being a voracious reader. He read everything. He owned something like 6,000 books on all sorts of topics. His own imagination and curiosity itself is just so fascinating. And I hope I conveyed that in the book, because that, for me, is what makes him such an important and interesting character, that he's interested in so many different things, and all of those things find their way into the film. So, so that's sort of the first part. The second part is, okay, how did this part 1 win the Stalin Prize and part 2 get banned? Yeah, how did that happen? Well, the one thing that people often don't realize is that part 1 almost didn't get the Stalin Prize. Many people who were on the committees that made that decision did not want to give it the prize. They were critical of it for all sorts of reasons. They found it anti-Russian. They found it definitely not socialist realist. They found it depressing. And mostly, the most important thing is that most people didn't really understand what kind of a ruler Ivan the Terrible was. And Soviet films did not do that, right? They did not present characters, especially rulers who were supposed to be Stalin, in this kind of complex, contradictory way. So even in part one, which many people have seen as a kind of monumental propaganda piece, was very complicated from the beginning and presented Yvonne as someone who was paranoid, as someone who was prone to violence, as someone who was worried about the great mission that and had doubts about the great mission that he undertook. So part one is really not that much less complex or dark than part two. And I think that a lot of the response to part one is based on people's assumptions about what kind of work of art you could make in the 1940s. People just assume that under Stalin, the only film that Eisenstein could make would be one that praised the ruler without any complications or negative sides. And so that's what they saw. American reviews saw it as a propaganda piece, pure and simple. But we have enough responses from the time, from letters to the film studio, letters to Eisenstein, and then all the committees that were responsible for censoring it, that show that many people saw the complications in it. Why did it get the Stalin Prize? That's actually the mystery. The mystery is why Stalin liked part one. And we know now that because since Perestroika, we know a lot more about how Stalin responded to artworks in general, but into this one in particular. And we know that he did not mind having a ruler prone to violence. He didn't mind that Stalin murdered his enemies, sometimes for no reasons. He just didn't want Yvonne to waver in those decisions. He wanted Yvonne not to have a moral conscience, not to waver about the great mission, the mission of founding the great Russian state. And he does from the very beginning. He recognizes that there's opposition, and he's torn about, in part one, how to deal with that opposition. Most of part one is about him being divided about that. So we know that some people at the time saw that, which is to say that it wasn't a simple decision to, it wasn't a simple propaganda piece. It was complicated. And Eisenstein himself thought that it might be received as being too pale, he said, as being not complicated enough, that people might not see the ways in which part one laid the foundation for the complexities and the increasing tendency to violence of part two. So he really saw them as one piece, and really, yeah, they're really one piece.
Right, and he meets with Stalin, right? And it's after certainly the Stalin's Prize, and this is before the ban of part two, I understand, or it's already after the ban, around that time. And could you please tell us what are they talking about?
What happened there?
Right.
It's a very famous conversation. It was published for the first time in, I think, 1988 during Perestroika. And people have read it all sorts of different ways, but it turns out to be a really complex document. So Eisenstein finished part two in February of 1946. He went to a dance celebrating, or a ball celebrating the Stalin Prize that he got for part one. He had a heart attack and he was in the hospital. He was very sick in the hospital when, so part two is finished, and everyone who saw it thought, this is not going to fly. But so they wanted to show it to Stalin right away. They wanted to show it to the committee that would decide whether it be released right away. So while Eisenstein is lying in the hospital, all these people saw part two, and they realized that it could not be released. And Stalin had a very explosive response to it. He said, this isn't a film, it's some kind of nightmare. Some kind of, I think, maybe a euphemism for stronger language, but that's how it comes down to us. So it was banned almost immediately. It was banned in March. It then became the subject for Zhdanov's criticism of art in the summer and fall of of 1946 and into 1940s, in 1946, 1947. And eventually Eisenstein became healthy enough to think about revising part 2 so that it could be released and finishing part 3. I'm kind of going on for a long time because everything having to do with this film is complicated. It's really hard to give short answers to anything. Anyway, Cherkasov and Eisenstein wrote to Stalin and said, let's meet and talk about finishing the film. And then in February of 1947, they meet. And suddenly Stalin sends a car for them to show up at the Kremlin in the middle of the night. And the conversation then goes on for about a little more than an hour. And Eisenstein and Cherkasov go out in Red Square and talk about it, take some notes on it. And then the record that we have is something that they dictated to a friend who wrote it down. So it's not a verbatim recording. And there are all sorts of things left out. So my impression of this conversation, trying to take into account all of those ellipses, and also then going back and looking at the archival version of the document, which has a list of other things that, a list of the things that Eisenstein and Cherkasov wanted to emphasize, suggests that there was a lot more going on in this conversation than meets the eye. I think that there was a lot that they didn't want to, well, first of all, I think this was a power play. So Stalin's purpose in having this conversation was to show Eisenstein who was in charge, that he could go do whatever he wanted with this film, but he better understand that the war was over and artworks were going to be censored much more strictly than they had been in the past. And that Eisenstein had been a little bit too arrogant and uppity in the way that he'd made part 1 and in the way that he'd made part 2, and Stalin wasn't going to put up with it. So my sense is that that was Stalin's purpose in the conversation. But there were also a lot of things that they didn't talk about. And I do argue in the book that one of the reasons Stalin did not like part 2 is because of the really pervasive homoerotic theme that runs through part 2. And I think that that really offended him.
Okay. Well, thanks. So far, the conversation that we have, first of all, I like it. It's fascinating, but it's also a conversation that probably you would have with one can have with a lot of students of the Soviet history. It's about politics. It's about politics of culture. It's about personalities. But your book is about much more than that. You're right about that you had to, I don't know, re-educate probably is the wrong term.
Well.
You had to educate yourself as a film scholar, as a film critic, as someone who really eventually acquired a very authoritative voice in terms of arts. And it is multidisciplinary undertaking, your book. And you also write that the film itself was quite multidisciplinary in that sense, that Eisenstein had to bring a lot there. And I wonder whether you could actually talk a little bit about that, and if, I don't know if our, this virtual environment allows that, maybe to show some images.
Yes, I have. I have a good example of how a lot of things come together for him, and how really to understand this film, you need to understand what he was doing visually and artistically, as well as what he was doing in terms of narrative and politics and history. And a really good example for talking about this is Eisenstein's theory of history. So he read a lot of sources about Ivan the Terrible, including some of the primary sources, secondary sources from the 19th century. But Eisenstein developed his own theory of history, which also had to do with his own theory of artistic production, which was that any work of art that's great is going to draw us in, is going to tap into our most primal feelings, as well as into our most advanced, complex ways of thinking. And that was also a model for the way he understood history and individual psychology. So everything sort of comes together for him here. His theory of history was that if you think about a spiral staircase, as we move sort of upward and become more advanced as civilizations, we always are circling back to our most primitive, primal selves as individuals and as cultures. And Eisenstein structured the history of Ivan the Terrible and the psychology of Ivan the Terrible along this sort of spiral, moving forward, but also always coming back to the beginning. And one of the ways he did this visually was to surround almost every scene with religious objects, with icons, with tapestries, with frescoes, with bas-reliefs, and they're all sort of distorted, and some are overwhelmingly large, and some are just strangely shaped. And Eisenstein, in his notes, wrote a great deal about how he wanted all of those images to always remind Yvonne of his childhood, to bring him back to remind him of how those icons were so overwhelming to him in childhood. And so then seeing those later on would cue him back to the events of his childhood, which were in fact really traumatic, as both his father died and then his mother was poisoned by the boyars. So I have a couple different scenes that do that, and I hope that this sharing will work the way we want it to. And here we go. So we start in Yvonne's childhood, which this was supposed to be at the very beginning of the film. And he's sitting here in the dark, and his mother's about to come out and be murdered. But look how overwhelming those images are. That's what Eisenstein wanted us to see later.
They are. Yeah.
And then we have the melodrama of Eisenstein's mother coming out, and this sets up a whole network of images that themselves are sometimes sort of, this is a sort of lived icon of Bogomatre, and but reversed, right? Mother and child, but reversed. And she's saying, beware the boyars because they've poisoned me. And now here's Yvonne also about to make an important decision about how to deal with the opposition. And he goes to see now his wife, who looks just like his mother, right? And in fact, he kind of treats her more like a mother and sort of asking for this kind of comfort. And she's surrounded by tapestries, which are the sort of womanly version of the icons and frescoes we see elsewhere. And in this scene, Yvonne has just decided to carry out his first political assassination, political execution. What does he do? He goes back to the same place. Again, reverting back to his wife has now been poisoned as well as his mother. And he goes back to this place of surrounded by these womanly icons, these tapestries. And he's trying to figure out what to do there. This is later on in part 2, where the Oprichniki are entering the cathedral, which, as Russian Orthodox cathedrals, are all sort of filled with frescoes the way this one is. But these are, I just want to point out that these are some very specific frescoes. So one of the ones, actually I'm going to pause it here for a second. One of the ones that we saw during that entrance of the Oprichniki was the wedding at Cana, which is from the Bible. It's where Jesus first turns water into wine. But if you remember that passage in the Bible, Eisenstein, Jesus didn't really want to turn water into wine. His mother kind of pushes him to do it. She nudges him, yeah, really, show people that you can do this miracle. So that's a mother and child story as well. So all these cues bring Eisenstein back to his childhood and remind him of the trauma of losing his mother and her telling him to beware the boyars, and Yvonne wanting revenge, choosing revenge against the boyars. And this is where, in this scene in particular, this is from the unfilmed part 3. This is a still of the giant fresco of the Last Judgment. And here, this is really meant to evoke for the viewer that same little boy overwhelmed by these images of God and of judgment. And here Yvonne does the same thing. He begs God for judgment, and then he, in fact, God is silent, as he tends to be, and Yvonne decides rather than forgiveness or peace that he is going to go even more violently against his enemies. So for Eisenstein, this historical, individual process of development is one that always circles back to original traumas or to some kind of origin story. And he wants the audience to feel Yvonne's feelings as he's struggling with these decisions. And so the visual cues themselves are not just for Yvonne, but they're for us to draw us in to Yvonne's experience. So I don't know, but that's just one of many examples of the ways that this film is so multi-layered and draws on so much of Eisenstein's knowledge and curiosity.
And the most striking part for me, for example, is that use of religious imagery, right? And again, we kind of can explain that, putting into the right context. 1943, the patriarchate is back and the church is back during the war. But still, even then, it is striking. It is so important for the entire film, for the entire movie, and that gets Stalin's prize. You write also about costumes, right? And the way how costumes are used in the book, and the way how you presented it, it's about the revolution. It's about the evolution of what happens with revolution. Like Ivan the Terrible's life, from innocent child to this bloody dictator. And that's probably something that Eisenstein, who was really the on a certain level propagandist at large of the revolution, was struggling with. So again, I wonder if you could comment on that, or maybe on the costumes again. Those.
They go together actually, because the way that he thought people could deal with these, could deal with power or not having power, was another kind of reversion to a very primal sort of scene. So he tells this great story in the book about playing with a child who lived in his apartment. And he found this more powerful than everything written about the way people deal with trauma. So he would play what he called wolf and bear with this little girl, and he would growl at her, and she would fight back. She would always fight back. But what really interested him is that she wouldn't fight back as herself. She would imitate him, and she would growl louder than he did. And the conclusion that he draws from this is a kind of anthropological one, that the way people deal or cultures deal with this feeling of powerlessness is to imitate the people who have power over them. And Eisenstein talks about that in terms of his father also. He says at one point that he did damage to himself in order to acquire the power that his father had over him, to act as the father to the child. And that, of course, gave him power, but it was damaging to himself. So the conclusion that he draws from this is that the way revolutions work is that people without power can overthrow a powerful government, but eventually the prey always become the predator, that there's a kind of inevitability of people without power wanting to become even worse than the people they're called for to overthrow. And this is all in great detail in his notes. So I can just share a couple, this is a little shorter, just some pictures. I need to get out of this. I'm sorry, and go back. Whoops. Yeah.
Okay, I assume that the images will reappear and John will be back. Okay. Well, that's kind of things that happen. And
Yeah, sorry.
okay, wonderful.
Okay, let's go back to this. There, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, so the example that I give of this is Malyuta Skuratov, who was one of Yvonne's major servitors, but starts out as a peasant who comes to overthrow Yvonne with a crowd at the very beginning of part one. And you can see here that he's dressed in this kind of homespun, crude tunic. And we see him like this several times in the film after this. But then he gets Yvonne's attention, and Yvonne makes him his major spy. And he skulks around the palace, spying on people. But what's interesting here is that he's wearing the oprichnik hasn't been invented yet or established yet, but he wears a kind of proto oprichnik costume as Yvonne's spy. And here they are after the oprichnik has been established, and they're wearing oprichnik costumes. And later these costumes are embellished with beautiful fur, but they remain this sort of black overcoat with these high shoulders that is their mark. It's very different, the austere black, from the kind of ornate brocade that the boyars wore, right? But look what happens to Skuratov later in part two. And this is when he's carrying out Yvonne's first execution against the boyars. He's still wearing his oprichnik overcoat, but it's open, and underneath his tunic now is boyar brocade. So he is becoming like the people that he was supposed to overthrow just at the moment that he carries out Yvonne's first really violent act. And even throws off that overcoat in this scene before he actually carries out the execution. And by the end of the film, I don't know how well you can see this image, but by the end of the film, you can see that he's wearing a brocade tunic, but he's also wearing an oprichnik overcoat that's now itself brocade. So he's really become the force that that the revolution was meant to overthrow, that Yvonne's revolution was meant to overthrow. Now, it's possible that, Eisenstein could have gotten those ideas from anywhere, but he writes a great deal about how the prey becomes the predator. And it seems to me that and he talks about it as a revolutionary process. And it seems to me that it's pretty inescapable that he's talking about revolutions that he witnessed.
Yes. Well, can you please tell us what was there in part three, which was never released, right?
Right, part three. He filmed about 20 minutes of footage. We had some of it, and we have a few little scenes from part three. But he died before he could finish it. So and he was very sick after his heart attack. So it's not really clear whether he would ever have been well enough to finish it. He did leave. I mean, one of the really interesting things about the whole project is that he left part two untouched. So the part two that we have is the part two that Stalin hated. And he showed it to some friends late in life. I mean, after the conversation with Stalin. And he decided that, well, we don't know exactly what, he never wrote about it actually, but he seems to have decided that that he would just leave it as the film that he wanted to make.
Thanks. I see that there are questions piling up in the chat, and I certainly encourage everyone to send more. But before maybe we will switch to that different stage of the discussion and conversation. I just wanted to say that the film is about the 16th century. The book is about the film that was done in mid-20th century. But at the same time, there is a ring of something that is very, very contemporary, something that makes you relate to that given the times that we live through right now. And again, I have my own take on that and explanation, but I wonder whether this is something that I'm making up, or there is that part in the book. There is something that you think resonates with today.
I would say that it resonates more and more every day. And let me put it this way. So a number of people have responded negatively to the statement that I make in the conclusion that this was an anti-Soviet film. It's filled with contradictions. It's filled with questions. Some of them don't have answers, but I have no doubt that Eisenstein was making a film that was both critical of Stalinism and also critical of many aspects of Soviet life, of Soviet ideology, of revolutionary progress, historical materialism, so subjectivity, and so on and so forth. But it's not a kind of reversion to a kind of Cold War dissident, conformist, simple position, right? And I think it's really important to say that just as we can live in worlds where we benefit from the governments that under which we live, all of us as academics certainly benefit from the privileges that are bestowed on us by public funding. But that doesn't stop us from being able to criticize the government at the same time, or any aspect of it, or the ideology that that supports it. And I think we need to give Eisenstein the same ability, right? I mean, he could benefit from Soviet society, could benefit from Kremlin patronage, and still be critical of the system itself.
It's about subversion, maybe? That's something that...
You know, I think subversion, dissidence, these words are all kind of buzzwords that distract us from what was going on. It's a very complex film. His criticism is never simple. It's never just a simple sort of, subversion or rejection, right?
Yeah.
If it's okay to leave it at that.
Thinking about the trajectory of the revolution, right? And we lived through the period of the democratic unraveling of the empire and high hopes and the emergence of authoritarianism, and that's what resonated with me in particular. But again, it's a multi-layer film and multi-layer book, and it should be read on more than one level. But before again, I promised to switch to the questions from the audience and keep delaying it. But in terms of the film, it was released on DVD, right? 2 parts. So for those of maybe who want first to read your book and then go from the book to the film, what is the easiest way to do that?
Well, it's on YouTube. So Mustfilm sometimes takes it down, but there was a new version made just when the book was coming out. So that's often available on YouTube. Although, as I said, sometimes it's not. The new version isn't always there. But the Criterion Collection released a very good version. And Yvonne and I both have special features on that that are great. And that's a really good version. And that version also has all the footage that we have from part 3. And some drawings and a few other. So it's actually a really good collection. And
the quality is good, right?
Quality's very good. Yeah. Translations are so-so, but.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks, Joan.
And I hope everyone will go watch the film. That's one of my goals.
How long is it, by the way? If you take all 3 parts.
It's about the 2 parts are about 3 hours. Not that bad.
3 hours. Okay, it's not bad. It's not bad. Yes.
It's not Dow.
Yeah. Okay, good. Excellent. So let me see what we got here. And the first question is, what do you consider the main complexities of the film? Again, the main complexities of the film.
Well,
I'm sure we answered that, but I think there is more ways to answer that question than.
Right. So the main complexity, I would say, is that it's organized around a series of questions. So Eisenstein is continually asking us, is Yvonne right in what, Yvonne asks himself, am I right in what I'm doing? And Eisenstein organizes the film around questions like that. So he constantly wants us to share Yvonne's doubts, and so the main character of the film is not a very clear sort of character, right? He himself is contradictory, fragmented, changing his mind, and so on and so forth. So, so that's one area of complexity. And then Eisenstein wanted to, the way the film was made, the sort of basic Eisensteinian aesthetic, was to reject basic Hollywood narrative styles, which try to make it as easy as possible to tell a story. And he wants to address us at our most primal feelings, as I said earlier, and our most complicated ideas. And the way he does that makes it hard to sort of relate to the characters the way that Hollywood draws us in. So it's really, it's a film that's challenging to the audience in every single scene. And then he puts so much into it. I mean, everything from Disney to Machiavelli to Shakespeare, obviously, to Shakespeare's contemporaries, to contemporary Russian literature, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. An enormous amount of culture is referenced, and that makes it complex.
Okay, thank you. So let me, again, I'm not going in the order, but I will hope to get all the questions. So the latest is, which films and filmmakers do you think have been most influenced by Yvonne the Terrible?
Yeah, that's hard for me. That's not a question that I can really answer. I would say all Soviet filmmakers who came after him, Tarkovsky by rejecting him, but not quite. Lots of, really everyone who saw this film writes about being influenced by it. Outside the Soviet Union, I mean, it's a really well-known film. It's, yeah, I'm not really the person to answer that question, sorry.
There was just sent a question which I consider to be kind of maybe a follow-up or related to that, in terms of the perception of the film in today's Russia, whether you can talk about.
Yeah, that's actually a really complex subject. I would say that, first of all, there's been an enormous amount published of Eisenstein's writing since the beginning of the 2000s. So amongst film scholars, there's a real shift in a perception of Ivan the Terrible to begin to really understand its complexity and understand the late Eisenstein. So Eisenstein, especially both in the Soviet, in Russia and in the rest of the world, has been sort of pigeonholed as the director who made Potemkin and developed montage when he was in his 20s. But montage really develops throughout his whole career. And he just expands on his initial insights. And so I think there's been much more appreciation of Eisenstein's mature period as being a period that is not just sort of getting rid of montage and doing whatever Stalin wanted him to do. In terms of public reception, I would say it's probably as wide-ranging as it is anywhere else. There are people who find the film really difficult and uninteresting and too stultified, and others who are just drawn in and love it as much as I do. So,
So let me go back closer to the top in terms of chronological order. So the comment is not to be confused with Ivan's childhood, Stalin's mother, did wish him to become a priest. Revolution divorced its own children. So it's a couple of statements. If you want to comment.
Well, I mean, Tarkovsky's
If not,
Yvonne,
we can move.
I assume that the question's about Yvonne's childhood, Tarkovsky's Yvonne's childhood, right?
Yes.
Well, Tarkovsky's really famous for rejecting Eisenstein and just about everyone else, actually. But Yvonne's childhood actually carries over some of the themes that we see in Ivan Grozny. So I think it's an interesting comparison, right? They're films that are interesting to compare. And of course, the revolution eating its own children. Yeah. I agree with that.
Well, bless you. There is the next question is, and yet he tried to please the authority, question mark. Soviet mentality had a great ability to compartmentalize their minds. So that's again, it's more like a comment. So
well, did he try to please authorities? I mean, that's a question. It's not clear to me that he tried to please authorities. He tried to make the film that he wanted to make and have it be released. But that seems to me to be a different kind of mentality than someone who went out of his way to please authorities, which I don't think he really, I don't think he constitutionally was capable of doing.
Well, I also was thinking when you commented that you don't consider that again, the question was whether it's an anti-Soviet film or not. And I was thinking, what does it mean when it is created by a person who actually is the creator of Sovietness in the film? How, well, again, he's not coming from outside. He's coming from inside. He's defining what it is and what it isn't. Again, but the anti-Stalinist or not anti-Stalinist, that's maybe a more kind of a clear-cut question. And
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if you look at the early films, which were revolutionary films, which are parallel to the ideology of the government at the time to celebrate the revolution, I think you can go back and look at the kinds of films that they were and see that they are sort of democratic socialist films in the sense that they celebrate the people overturning unjust authorities, which is hardly, which is a Soviet theme. Revolution's a good thing when you have unjust authorities, but it's hardly Stalinist, right? And I think that many elements of the sort of ideal subjectivity, the new Soviet man and woman, it's possible to have made the founding myths of the revolution, films that, you know, sort of laid the groundwork for the myths of the revolution and still question some of the elements of that ideology. And I would say that as Eisenstein grew older and watched the degeneration of the revolution, that that was his trajectory.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me now.
Great questions.
Yes. Was there a script storyboard for part 3?
Yes, there's a script. And in terms of storyboard, yes, there were drawings for part 3 as well. Yes, and those are readily available. I mean, the script has been published in Russian and English, in many different languages, and many of the drawings are available.
Okay, thank you. I'm moving down that screen that I have. Your work builds on extensive and deep archival research and engagement with primary sources. What are your thoughts about the future of international archival scholarship in an increasingly isolated world? Even before the pandemic, it was becoming extremely hard for foreign scholars to get research visas to Russia for political and bureaucratic reasons.
That's a really good question. I mean, there's sort of two answers. On the one hand, more and more is becoming available in digital archives. And this is true, or at least it was true of Argali, where the Russian State Archive of Literature and Art, where Eisenstein's papers are. And that was run under a surprisingly really sort of international regime under its previous director. So we had very open access to Eisenstein's papers and other things in that archive. I don't really know what the situation is there now, to be honest. So I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen once things start opening up again. I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen in the United States over the next 2 months, to say nothing of what's happening in Russia. So but I'll say this, if we go through a period where it becomes really hard to do archival research for foreigners to do archival research in Russia, I suspect that won't last forever. And that history has a way of working in cycles. And I hope that that's true. And I hope that we can continue to share documents digitally more and more, which I think is especially happening. Actually, Russia has been one of the leaders in digitizing archives. So yeah. So I don't know. Maya, I see this is your question. Hello. I don't have that same, I'm an optimist. I'm thinking things are going to be okay.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'll put on here my hat of the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute and say, go to Ukraine.
Yeah.
You can't do Eisenstein there, but you can do Dziga-Vertov. So good. Now.
And much more.
Yeah, and much more, yeah. Now, Joan, thank you so much for an incredible book and for your interest to our history and culture. I'm writing a research about the movie dedicated to Peter the Great, 1937, of Vladimir Petrov. And I find it so complicated looking for a Stalin direct review of film. How did you manage it to find all his critical reviews on the scenarios, question mark?
Okay, well, all the material that I used is in Eisenstein's archive, and in Eisenstein's archive or in the archive of Mosfilm. So there were discussions about the film, about both films. The Stalin Prize Committee's deliberations were written down, so those exist. And as far as Stalin's own view of the film, those we have from people who were there when he screened it. And those are available too. I mean, there's a book about Stalin's view of films, and a lot of the people took down what he said about them during the screenings. So, and some of those have been published as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And here is a question that actually was on my list, but somehow it's drop of it. How widely would the film parts 1 and 2 have been viewed in the late 1940s?
Okay, well, part 1 was viewed very, very widely in 1945 and afterwards. It was screened on the front. It was screened everywhere. It was sent all the way around the world. Part 2 was banned and was not shown until 1958. And that was the beginning sort of also the rehabilitation of Eisenstein after Stalin's death.
Okay, thanks, Roger. And it looks like this is the question maybe
that we had before.
Perhaps the history runs in spiral, and that probably is the question that brings you back to the origins, like it was happening.
Right, exactly.
Eisenstein, exactly. Yes.
Certainly Eisenstein believed that. I don't know if I believe that, but he did.
Okay. Well, excellent. Thanks. Thank you so much, first of all, for researching and writing this book, and then
thank you. And thank you for appreciating
this conversation.
For the great questions. Yeah.
And you're wonderful in showing all these things, sharing the screen. You're ready to teach online. It's over. You're ready to do that. So
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, and to everyone who was watching or who will be watching that program. The right order is first to read the book and then watch the film. So
No, watch the film while you read the book.
okay, so we can.
Okay, thank you very much.
There's more than one right way.
Yes, there's more than one way.
It's complex. Thanks again. Thanks, John, and thanks for everyone who was able to join us today.
Thank you.